Welcome back to a special edition of Our Walk in Christ, and today we are going to be reviewing the complete Jewish Bible. This was recommended to me by a friend when I was down in Arizona, and he says this is the best version of the Bible ever. It does the best historical stuff. It was really pitched up to me. And so I thought, let's go ahead and have a look at it. I read a different version of the Bible every year, so swang by a bookstore, picked one up, probably paid more for it than I should have because Amazon sells them at like half off. So link in the Amazon link in the description down below if you want to pick up a copy. That'll be an affiliate link of mine to my affiliate account. But it is definitely an interesting and compelling version of the book. Let me first tell you the history and the background. Now, actually, before we get into there, let's talk briefly about the theology of Jewishness and Christianity and Jewishness, because there is a little bit of an infighting, not a massive one. It's not like the Calvinist Arminius debate or the pre-tribulation rapture debate, but there are certain sects of Christianity that believe that everything the Bible would have promised towards Israel no longer applies towards Israel, and all of that now applies to the Christians instead. And that is a view that is held by large major denominations, primarily portions of the Presbyterian Church would believe that. There's probably a few other ones out there as well. And the question is are the prophecies mentioned inside of the Bible for us these days or not? That is something that you need to investigate for yourself. And I have my own personal opinions. We'll probably get a bit of that throughout the video here. But what I wanted to mention is just to say that there are some sects that think that there is nothing that the Jewish community has to do with the gospel, the church, the Bible anymore. And there are others that say, no, the Jewish part is still well and alive. It's just us as Gentiles have been grafted in. And indeed, that's exactly what Romans tells us, that we have been grafted in. So, about the Bible itself, this is put together by a Messianic Jew. A Messianic Jew is a person who is Jewish of origin and Jewish of religion, who then converted his life to Christianity, recognizing that the Jewish religion was consistent with Jesus as the Messiah, and now is a saved Jewish person. That is what the intention is to say, I wanted to do this book. In fact, he specifically mentions that he wanted to do a book which gives a unity between the Jewish culture and the New Testament. And that really was what his goal was as he wrote this. And so I actually want to read what his actual purposes are, because they are listed. The purposes of this version of the Bible, he has a fourfold purpose. Purpose one is to, as I said, restore the unified Jewishness of the Bible, and particularly to show that the book of the New Covenant are Jewish through and through. Number two, the second aim of the complete Jewish Bible is to express the Word of God, the Tanakh and the Brit Hashah, together in an enjoyable modern English. I want the Bible to be more accessible and easy to read, flowing easily from page into the mind and heart, unimpeded as much as possible by the differences between the environment of the Bible and that of the present. My third purpose, number three, is to make the CJB fully usable in a Messianic synagogue, where the Brit Hadashah would be read in the service along with the Torah and the prophets. And they actually do have listed through the Old Testament portions of the New Testament that you would read with those. And number four, I am finally supplying at last what my fans have been asking for, a single volume containing my entire version of the Bible. So that was what the goal was. And for sure, they are laudable goals. There are a couple of small problems, and that is that first and foremost of his basic fundamental view, I do not believe that the New Testament is Jewish through and through. It definitely shows a grafting of the Gentiles into the Jewish faith. We have to recognize that, and that will be one of the cons about this Bible that I will talk about throughout. But overall, he wanted primarily a translation. Now, as far as this book is concerned, let's talk about the format of it before we get into the ins and outs. Now, the format of the book itself it's very nice. It is a modern, beautiful translation, or a modern, beautiful print, rather. The Old Testament references in the New Testament are bold and isolated and referenced, so you can very quickly go and figure out where those are from. The color scheme is nice. It is pleasing and easy and good to look at. And overall, the text size is good. It is an easy book to pick up and read. You're not really going to struggle with it, unless, of course, you really need that large print. Now, the copy I have does not have any textual notes, although there is in the back of it a dictionary of the Jewish terms. There is a study Bible version as well, where he really applies the Jewish and the Messianic faith to the Bible in many ways. I don't have that. I did not read that one. That is actually the one that my friend recommends. But the look of it is pretty good. Now, the big downsides, and this is going to come down in a con, is it tries to be everything all at once. In the Old Testament particularly, there are several places, notably the Psalms and some of the prophets, where the numbering of the prophets, the numbering of the text rather, carries with it both the Jewish, and it also carries with it the Christian views. And so what ends up happening as an end result of that is that the numbers can be out of order or a little bit hard to recognize as you're going through the text, and then there's a 1 and then a parenthesis 5, or a 1 in a parenthesis 0, indicating that doesn't have a verse in the New Testament, in the Christian Bible rather, but it does in the Jewish Bible. And the most notable case where that is observed the most is in the book of Malachi, where apparently in the Jewish tradition, Malachi is 3 chapters, not 4. No, they have not omitted the rest of the verses. It's just that in the Jewish Bible, Malachi only has 3 chapters, and the last 6 verses, which are chapter 4 in the Christian Bible, are appended to chapter 3 of the Jewish Bible. Now, I am not 100% sure if his organization is specifically Jewish or not. He says this is the organization of the Bible at the time of Christ. So the Jewish Bible at the time Jesus walked the earth. I was talking to a few other people who have put a little bit more study into the organization, and this does have something that he alleges is out of place. If you do study this, I would love to know which is correct down below. What he said is the word used for the woman in the Proverbs 31 is only used twice in the Old Testament, once as the Proverbs 31 woman and once as Ruth, to describe Ruth. And so he said that the Bible should have Proverbs and then directly into Ruth. This organization does not. There is one book in between them. I think it's either Ecclesiastes or Song of Solomon, or who knows, maybe both of them are. It's not like I could, open it up and look very briefly at the table of contents and tell you. But the overall principle is that he says that it should be it should go from Proverbs directly into Ruth, but this actually goes Psalms, Proverbs, Job, then Song of Songs, then Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, then Daniel, then Ezra, Nehemiah, and then it ends the Old Testament with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So it is definitely an interesting read to look at the how it's put together. Now, as far as the text itself, we do have a couple fundamental problems. The number one major fundamental problem is it is a translation done by a single person. Now, biases always have to be, always show up as you're translating. And if you study the original languages, there is not an exact this word always means this word language to language. There's times you need to look at the original, look at the surrounding context, and make a distinction about what that text was actually supposed to mean. When you have a big translation committee, these things are debated and they come to a consensus as to what it is. Now, is that good or bad? I'll leave that to your own interpretation. The problem is there was no committee or consensus. This Bible is translated by one person, and only the New Testament is translated. The New Testament is translated. Specifically, he used the critical text, which makes the New Testament translation in line with all of the other translations of the Bible, almost all the other translations of the Bible, with the exception of King James and New King James, which both use the Textus Receptus. So it does use that, but he does openly declare that his Bible, his translation of the New Testament, is definitely more of a dynamic equivalency. So he's going for a thought for thought based on this, adding in the Jewishness of the text itself. Now, the Old Testament is a different case. He is not a Hebrew scholar, despite he lives in Israel. He is not a Hebrew scholar, particularly an ancient Hebrew scholar. And so what he did in looking everything over is he just kind of said, I didn't want to translate it. He finished his New Testament work at the age of 60. He did not want to read, go through all of the issues of translating from the Hebrew, and he relies on the Hebrew versions of the text for the Old Testament rather than the current ones that we use as the Christian church, which don't differ by a ton. But there is a little distinction, which even departs from the King James, and New King James does use the same Hebrew text as we use in the Bible then. Now, what he did then is he wanted to base it off of, and that's the Masoretic text, is what he says. Now, the problem he had with the Old Testament is that he didn't want to translate it, and he couldn't find an existing copy that he could use. He approached a couple of people asking, they use their translation for his, but then he, despite giving permission for one, he didn't want to use that because he didn't want to use a Christian translation for the Jewish Bible. So he took the recently public domain, I think it was called the New Jewish Bible, or was it the JPS? I don't know. It was one of the Jewish translations of the Old Testament just hit public domain. Unfortunately, like most texts like that hit the public domain, it is rife with Old English. So he wanted to first start doing simple text replacements, but everything got worse and worse. So what he did is for the Old Testament is he paraphrased it. So the Old Testament that we have is a paraphrase, not a translation. So the Old Testament paraphrase, New Testament dynamic equivalent translation from the Jewish perspective. And that is really what he is looking at. Now, as far as the positives of the translation, he is certainly teaching more about the history of the text. However, we'll get to that in the con. We'll just do the positives first. He uses some of the Jewish words that teach the basis of the translations and the traditions of the Jewish faith, so we can better kind of understand how the Jewishness would fit into the faith that we have, because while Christianity is a faith for the whole world, the Jews and the Gentiles, there does have with it some Jewish element to be considered. And so we have to consider that. So we have we also have a closer translation to the names of God. He is not just going to say God or some other thing like that. What he's going to say is he's going to use Elohim. He's going to use Yahweh. He's going to use the translations for the word of God, the names of God that specifically speak to what they're trying to do. And so he does do an excellent job of highlighting the Old Testament in the New Testament text. And some of the best examples of that are in Romans chapter 15 and in the book of Hebrews, where in those two sections you can really see the amount of the Old Testament in there and the amount of the New Testament in there, and you can very quickly and easily see what's what. Does a really good job of tying the Old Testament to the New Testament, which is definitely something as modern Christians we really need. It is a weakness of our church that we do not do a lot of combining the Old Testament with the New Testament. Now, all of those are good positives, and there's a lot of positive to this, but there are some serious negatives with this translation that will certainly knock it off of my list of the best translations. Obviously, the first one we've already mentioned. It is a translation and a paraphrase done by one person. And that always raises some flags, because whether you might accidentally introduce some form of bias or intentionally introduce some form of bias. And I think there is some intentional introducing some form of bias in here. In other words, this is, in many ways in the New Testament, it is too Jewish. Okay? He even translates in several places Gentile congregations as the Messianic community. Remember, a Messianic community is a group of Jewish people who believe that Christ was the Messiah. That is what the word Messianic means. Now, without providing any form of other definition, he simply throws Messianic community every place a reference to the church is. While there are certainly cases where that makes sense, like the church in Jerusalem is certainly more often than not a Messianic community, the church in Romans and in Galatians and in Ephesians and in Corinthians are not. Yet all of these, Galatians 1:2, 2 Corinthians 1:1, 2 Colossians, 2 Corinthians 1:1, both reference to the Messianic community. This is not a Messianic community. This is a church. There is a distinct difference there, and he doesn't want to see that distinct difference because his bias translates a dynamic equivalency of the New Testament to be explicitly biased towards being explicitly Jewish. And it is not. It is both a Jewish and a Gentile book. It is a book for the faith of the whole world. And that is something we have to keep in mind. Now, one of the next problems we have is, as far as some of these modern translations go, is he is gender neutral to a fault. Okay, gender neutral to a fault. Galatians 1:1. I received my commission not from human beings or through human mediation, but through Yeshua the Messiah and God the Father. While I do appreciate Yeshua the Messiah, God the Father, those are definitely more Jewish. I have not received my commission from human beings. I think men is probably a better word there, particularly since the leadership of the church is explicitly handed to males in the Bible, not whoever happens to be the leader. I'm sorry, but that brings me to another point. His entire text, the introduction to the chapters. Okay, he has interesting introductions to the chapters, but I find myself not liking the translator as much after reading those than if I didn't have those at all and just reading it, because he comes off as a humanist. He's using the dating system, using the common era dating system, rather than relying on that Messiah that he claims to love so dearly. And I say claims to love. I have no doubt he's not saved. He's certainly a saved man to do such an endeavor. Okay, but the thing is, if you are that saved, why are you using the common era stuff? But also, he mentions in the book of Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis 1-11 were probably written upon clay tablets, passed through Noah, through the early patriarchs, all this kind of stuff, a bunch of blithering nonsense. The first 5 books were written by Moses. They were dictated by God. That's why we know they're the best history of translation. So almost all of his book introductions had some form of crazy, modern, scholarly, worldly approach to them. And that in and of itself was enough that I kind of throws up some red flags for me. We already mentioned the chapter numbering in the Old Testament, including both the Christian and the Jewish numbers. It would have been better if he picked one or the other and made a reference to that or something in the footnotes. But putting each of the chapters where there was a difference between the verse numbers, having multiple verse numbers all over the place, was actually kind of confusing. And then you have to remember, which one's Jewish, which one's Christian? I just don't know. And so that raised itself a certain issue. Some words, particularly in the New Testament, are just Hebrew versions, and it didn't seem to make sense as to why. I mean, it's one thing if we're talking about, so something that's directly Jewish, Sabbath using a better word for it. But it's just it was kind of like when you're learning a language and you're doing simple word replacements to try and remember the words by, the dog ran fast. And you take out the word ran and you put whatever that is in whatever language you're learning, the dog, blah, blah, fast, And then you get this kind of idea. Well, it seemed like he was doing that, just picking random words and throwing the Jewish word for it in there. And for some reason, it didn't seem to make sense. So in that case, Matthew 26:40 is Talmud instead of disciples. What is the significance of saying the Talmud instead of the disciples? There were other words as well. Kohanim instead of the priests. We have Mikta. I don't even remember what that one is. We have Shekinah. I have no idea. the Rosh Hadashes, that is the, I completely spelled and probably pronounced that wrong. That's the Holy Spirit. So it's like there's some words that, these are the Christian charged words. So we're going to change all the Christian charged words to the Jewish version. That makes sense. And so for these reasons, those are really the negatives I saw. So I found even me knowing the Bible extraordinarily well, knowing the Bible as well as I do, I had a hard time reading this Bible. A lot of it is just because the Jewish names for the cities and the people and the random Hebrew words, it took too much mental energy to remember what's going on. And oftentimes I only know who that person was because I already know the context of that person in another story. If you are new to the Bible or not as familiar with it, this is going to be a bad read for you. I would not recommend it for you. If you're looking for a new Bible to study and you want to draw closer to God, do not use the complete Jewish Bible. It will completely confuse you, particularly because the books are out of order from how they're used in the rest of the Christian church. And so what ends up happening is you can get lost, you don't know where you're at, and then you're learning where things are in the wrong place, and it will possibly hinder your faith down the road. Because there's nothing about this that is so amazing that I would highly recommend it. Now, that being said, is it bad? Does it need burned with fire? No, it's actually really good. If you are a Bible scholar, I would recommend you get a copy of it. So you can see the Jewishness, you can see the differences between the things. It is a great Bible to have on your shelf for good reference. You might look up a reference to God and see that he uses the better Hebrew word for God, because there's several words for God. You have your Yahweh, you have your Elohim, you have Jireh, and there's a number of them. I don't remember them all off the top of my head. So it is a good book for the academic person who really wants to dig a little bit more, look a little deeper, and see the Bible from the Jewish perspective. Because it is true, sometimes the modern Protestant Christian church and the Catholic Church, and I don't necessarily have a lot of agreement with the Catholics, but I'll just mention them here for sake of completion. A lot of these churches, in these cases, they don't see any Jewishness of the faith, and that also is a problem. But I do think the complete Jewish Bible swings the pendulum way too far in the other direction, making it way too Jewish. And so we need to find a balance in the middle. So if you are an academic, a studied person, somebody who really wants to dig into different translations, I do recommend having a copy of the complete Jewish Bible on your shelf. Because the way it's put together with all the Jewishness to it is itself very good, but I don't think it's necessarily the best Bible that you can use to study the scriptures on your day-to-day, because I think it will distract and it will lead you into too much of a Jewish view, whereas the real reality is we as the Gentiles have been grafted in to the Jewish promises. And just as God can graft us in, God can also cut us out. We have to keep that level of grace among it. So that is my thoughts and my take on the complete Jewish Bible. Let me know your thoughts about these in the comments down below.